Welcome back, guys. We're continuing our API development journey and we'll be exploring the put verb at this time. Now, put is similar to the post, except it is mainly used to either create if it doesn't exist or update if it does exist. So let's get started, and when we test it, that will make a bit more sense to you. So the first thing that I would want to do is to replicate the kind of restriction as to who can access the put. To me, if you can't create, then you shouldn't be able to update, right? Once again, context rules, but I'm just going to authorize, and well, I'm just going to authorize. So I'm not even going to make it role based, right? So the administrator can create, but then once you're authorized, you can go ahead and you can go ahead and update, sorry, regardless of your role. All right, so the next one would be HTTP put. That is our new verb. And more or less, we're going to have the same return codes, except I'll be doing something differently for this one. So let me just comment this one out, and when we get there, then we'll adjust it. So we have our method stub, and I'm just going to copy so I can move quickly with prepping this method stub. All right, and this one will be update hotel. Now, in terms of the DTO that will be used for update hotel, well, firstly, we need the parameter for the ID. Now, there are two schools of thought, or well, maybe three schools of thought on this matter. Well, let's say two. School of thought number one is that I need to have the ID in the URL, just like how we had with the get, right? I need you to pass in the ID with the URL, but then one school of thought would say that the DTO also needs to have the ID. So that means the client needs to pass in the ID with the URL and pass it in the body of data to be updated. Now, that is one potential validation point where you would check if the ID that was sent in the URL matches the ID sent over in the payload or the DTO. And if there's a mismatch, then you return maybe bad request. All right, so that is one method of doing it. And I'm just talking you through it before I actually do it. The other one would be that the DTO doesn't need to have the ID because the ID is going to be in the URL. So I expect you to pass over the URL with the ID of the record you wish to update, and then you just pass me the updated information and I apply it accordingly. Now, that is also an acceptable train of thought. They're both acceptable. Once again, context rules. So some people feel more comfortable with the double check, having the ID in the URL and the body, and then you check, and then if they don't match, then you reject the attempt. Some people don't mind having it one place and just going along with the operation. So we're going to take the approach where we have it one place and not in the DTO. Now, because of that, I could use the create hotel DTO, but then to me, that would kind of violate the single responsibility rule that I've been kind of promoting, because when you say create hotel DTO, it tells anybody reading the code that this is for creation. Why is it in the update? Now, you have two options again. You could either rename this to maybe something like upsert, where this DTO serves the double purpose of creating and updating, or inserting and updating, hence the portmanteau upsert, right? But then once again, still single responsibility. Depends on how strict you want to be. You could also realize that you might have varying fields in the two DTOs, because what you would accept for creation, you might not expose all of that for potential update. So you want to consider all those things. So what I would do is actually create a second DTO. So I created another one. I call it update hotel DTO. In this context, everything that is here for the creation is fair game for update. All right. So I'm not going to go ahead and create another one. All I did was just inherit. So I'm just doing this because of the single responsibility concept that I have in mind. I just want to make sure that when you see update hotel DTO, you know what it's for. However, otherwise, what you would probably want to do is just be more particular with the fields that you expose in the update DTO. And we've seen where that can help with some control already. So I'm just going to go ahead with that level of inheritance. Once again, that's up to you. We just want to write clean code and make sure it's readable at the end of the day, right? So I'm taking the ID in the parameter, and then I'm taking the fields for the update in the body of the request. So I'm going to start off with my validation check. So I'm going to say if not model state dot is valid, if it is not valid, or if the ID value sent over is less than 1, because I mean, it should be at least 1, right? It can't be 0 or negative. So in either situation, I just want to log and return bad request that something is wrong with your attempt. All right. And then we can move on to our try and catch. And then we know that for the catch section, we're going to be logging the error as well as returning the status 500, right? So let us see what we're going to try. Now, in order to try, I need the original record that needs to be updated. So what I have to do is actually say var hotel is equal to await unit of work dot hotels dot get me the record. So I put in my filter where the ID is equivalent to the ID coming in through the parameter. All right. Then I can do another check. I can say if hotel is equivalent to null. So I could have done a search. Maybe they passed in the ID 10. I only have 6 hotels and they pass in 10 with something to update. I'm going to try and find it, but I need to make sure that I actually found it, right? So then I would probably return a bad request. So let's just say I do the same thing here, but in the bad request section, I'm going to say submitted data is invalid. All right, so there's no model state here. It's just a matter of does the record with that ID exist or not. And you could actually even just extend the unit of work to do the exists. But what I'm doing is just getting it one time. If it's null, then we end it. However, if it is not null, then we can go ahead and try to do our update. Now, a quick way to kind of equate the two would be to use the mapper dot map, and then I can say at this point, what is the source? So the source here is hotel, and then I'm going to say I want it to be, no, I'm sorry, the source would be the hotel DTO. My apologies. So hotel DTO is the new source because hotel DTO has the latest information, and then I'm going to say hotel to the right. So if we look at this mapper overload, it takes 2 things, the source and the destination, and then what it's going to do is just map what's in the source to the existing destination. So effectively, we just said whatever is in this, put it in that. If there are 2 fields that are not equal, then please update this one with the fields coming from the DTO, right? And then we can now say unit of work. Now the problem is that we did not do any tracking. So if we were doing tracking, we could have just said save, but we are not tracking. So I have to say update and then pass in hotel, right? And then we unit of work save. So just one extra line of code, not too bad. So the thing is that, remember I was explaining that with the update method, what we did was to say, please pay attention to whatever entity is here, attach it and change its state to modified. So know that it's modified. So when we save, it will be kind of in the register to be saved or updated, right? If we had not, or if we had made the tracking optional, then we wouldn't have had to take that extra step of saying update. We could have just done the change and saved because tracking is actually by default. So I'm just explaining that little bit to you because I did mention it. So let us, after we save, we can return no content. So no content seems like a bad reply, but it's really a 204, which is anything in the 200 range is good, right? So that's a good, because I don't have anything to tell you. Like, okay, you sent an update. Okay, there's nothing more to do. You are good to go, right? So that's what the no content is really for. So coming back to the one that we commented it out, I'll just say status 204. So let us test that. So just to bring your attention to what Swagger is doing, you'll see that each type is nicely color coded. So if the word wasn't enough, then you see the color code put is nicely stated there. And there's our DTO with the fields, and it's expecting an ID value in the parameters. All right, so let's use Postman. And I'm going to go right back to the last hotel that we created. So this was our successful post attempt and we got it back. So the ID value is 6. So I'm going to say put is my verb and I'm passing in 6 as the ID value. And then I'm going to put a comma. This was misspelled. It's a tiny change, right? But let's just say the comma and the rating isn't really 5, but it's 4.8 for Moon Palace Jamaica Grand Resort. And well, the country is Jamaica, so let's leave that. So let's go ahead and send and see what happens. All right, method not allowed. And oh, I think I know why. We didn't put on the parameter allowance here on the put. So the same way that we have this on the HTTP GET, I have to specify on the put that it should take that parameter. So apologies, let's just add that and let's try this again. So back in Postman, I think I should get a 401 this time. All right, that's better. So the 405 method not allowed means that either you have something wrong with the request or your endpoint needs to be fixed to match how the request should look. So just now, that's what we ran into. We had the request properly, but then the endpoint was lacking. All right, so it's good to see these little things along the way so that when they happen, you can take on control of the situation. So what we need to do is get a token, and I believe I still have my user request over here. So it's really cool with Postman. You can always go back and get previous requests. So let me just grab my token, come back over here, add it to the authorization header, and then try this again. And it's hitting my end. I set a breakpoint there. All right, so let's continue. And there it is, 204 no content. So it has successfully processed the request, but is not returning any content. Well, no content. But once again, a 204 is a good return type. So let us now go over to our previous get and see what happens. And I have a token. So let me just go ahead and put this token here and do the get. And then we will see, all right, there's our comma and there's the rating change to 4.8. So as far as we're concerned, the put works. Now, just building on what the put does and doesn't do. You see, if you miss off something, let's say you have some fields that are not required, all right? Right now, it's hard to test, but I'm going to go ahead and modify this DTO. So let me go over to create DTO, and I'm going to say that the address field is not required. All right, I'm going to restart. So while it's restarting, let me just explain what we're about to do. The put is always going to replace the data. The only thing it doesn't replace is the ID, pretty much, right? So anytime you're going to do a put, you have to be mindful that whatever data is there, it is going to use it to replace. So if I don't provide an address, let's say I take address out of this payload, it's no longer required. I don't provide an address, but I'm doing the put, I'm doing the update, right? Same hotel, and I'm doing the update, and I send. All right, so I'm getting a 204 no content, but look at what happens to my data. So notice we had an address value. Now address is null. So you have to be careful whenever you're using these kinds of updates, or at least the put, because it's always going to replace it with the data that it got. So it is on you to make sure that your validations represent the data quality that you really want from your client application. Whether you are building the client or it's a third party who is building the client, the API is yours and you have to set that standard, because it not being required allowed a null value to be there. Now, once again, that could be good or bad based on your situation, but that is how the put will work. So I'm going to encourage you right now to pause, replicate the put endpoint for the countries controller, and then we're going to look at something else as it relates to the put and how we can enter a bit more data than we're allowing right now. All right, so we're back, and I hope you paused and attempted it yourself, but I already did the update country, and I'll just walk you through it quickly. There's nothing here that's out of the ordinary compared to the hotels. Everything is fairly standard. We have the create country DTO, which I need to update. There we go. It's a good thing I'm doing this review. All right, so we update country DTO, and everything else just looks the same way. Now, one thing that I want to point out with the update country DTO is that I have included this property, which is a list of hotels. All right, so yes, arguably I could put it here and then remove it from this one and then let the country DTO inherit from the update country DTO, since it has all of these and the list. So this would get everything. Yes, you could do that, but then this is just driving home a point that you really want to kind of keep your DTOs as unique as possible, because then, you know, you may have shared fields, sure, but then you may have unique fields also along the way. Now, the relevance of this list of hotels is that I can actually use my put to update a company and also insert new hotels or related hotels. Because remember that hotels, this means that one country has a list of hotels, right? One country has many hotels, which is why we can reference them by list here. All right, so let us explore what that would look like. So if I go over to my Swagger documentation and then look at the potential payload, you see here where they are showing me that I can put in the name, the short name, and then an array of hotels, right? And then I can put in details for the hotel. And of course, the hotel has potential details for the country. And then this is what they really meant when they said it could become cyclic, because it's just one big thing after another after another. However, we're going to try this and we're going to insert a new hotel with, a new country with a new hotel. So I'm going to just duplicate this put. So I can just right click, say duplicate tab, since I already have it there. Before I do that, let me see all of the countries I have. So I don't really have any tests with country. So let me get all my countries so I can see my options. So I have Jamaica, Bahamas, and Cayman Islands. And see if we need to update Cayman Islands, because I have Cayman Island. It should be islands. Cosmetics, but let us go ahead and update that. So I'm going to take, let me just get my bearings. So I'm going to take the payload from the sample, all right, from our Swagger, and then the countries, the country's ID that I want to update. I'm just trying to find where that was. All right, the country's ID is 3. So the name will be Cayman Islands. The endpoint would be country /3. All right, the short name still CI. So once again, you have to provide the value that you expect to have there afterwards. All right, and then I'm going to, inside of the hotel section, remove anything that I really don't want. All right. As a matter of fact, let me go back over to the DTO. I just noticed that I'm listing out hotel DTO here. So I did say we could consolidate, but here's a good reason. I'm not consolidating. I said hotel DTO. Hotel DTO then puts in the ID. But if I'm doing an insert, I'm updating Cayman Islands while I want to insert a new hotel automatically, which means I don't need the ID value. So this DTO is actually incorrect. What I should have here is create hotel DTO, which is a better representation of the data I wish to collect. And that would also get rid of the excess fields like the country and the extended list of hotels. So let's try that again. All right. So now when I look in Swagger and I look at the schema, that looks much better. So you see, DTOs are very important. What do you require from your user? Make sure you expose only that. So I'm going to take this corrected payload, go back to Postman, and this will be far less confusing for me, right? So let's try this again. This is going to be Cayman Islands with a capital I, right? The short name is still CI. I have to provide that. And then in the hotels section, I can actually list out the hotels or objects of hotels. So this square bracket means array. Then the curly brace encapsulates all the object properties. Then I can say comma and list. So I can just do comma and continuing to put them in, right? So here I'm going to put in the Ritz-Carlton, and its address is Grand Cayman. It has a rating of 4.5. And another one, the local hotel. So these are actually hotels in Grand Cayman. You can look them up if you want to verify that. However, I'm not going to specify the country ID. All right. So I'm actually going to remove country ID, but then I do have it as required. So I'm going to remove it in the payload. And what I'll do is make the change in the code itself for the DTO. Let's just go over there and make it not required, at least just for this experiment. And let us try that. So change made, we have the list of hotels. They're not referencing any country at the moment. However, they are underneath the country's payload. We have the country ID as 3. So let us send. And I'm getting a 204 no content. So let me go and check. So let me get the list of hotels and see what came back. All right, here we go. So we have the local hotel coming back with an ID of 7 and the Ritz-Carlton coming back with an ID of 8. And both of them are part of country 3 or Cayman. So you see, that is how you can actually use the put. So the put will say, does this thing exist? If not, I will create it. And the only way it knows it exists is if the ID value is provided. So when there's no ID value, it's going to say, well, this doesn't have an ID, so I will go ahead and create it. However, because of our constraints that we put on our endpoint, we are not allowing people to just use the put to create, because we do verify that an ID value must be present, or a sensible ID value must be present before we move on. So those are little constraints that you can use to make sure that the put operates how you want it to. However, its global operation is very versatile.